Nearly 12,000 years ago, long before the pyramids rose above the sands of Egypt, long before Stonehenge, long before the first cities, kingdoms, or written words, the world may have witnessed an event so dramatic that its memory survived only as fragments, hidden inside myths, buried beneath layers of earth, and whispered through stories that no one could ever prove. Entire landscapes changed, vast ice sheets retreated, oceans rose, animals that had dominated the planet for thousands of years vanished. And somewhere in that forgotten chapter of human history, our story begins. Before we continue, one thing must be absolutely clear. What you're about to hear is a work of fiction. No real space agency, no real artificial intelligence, and no real archaeological team has confirmed anything you are about to hear. This is a speculative story, built the way a novel is built, and it asks a single question. What if someone had once been here and had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that future generations would never be completely certain they existed? What if the greatest mystery in human history was not hidden because it was impossible to find, but because it was designed to look like nothing more than ordinary history? Nothing that follows should be mistaken for a genuine scientific discovery. It is an exploration of possibilities, inspired by real evidence woven together with imagination. Now let the story begin. There is a date that keeps appearing throughout real human history, and despite decades of research, no one can fully explain why it seems to mark such an extraordinary turning point. Around 9006. 100 years before the modern calendar, give or take a century depending on the dating method being used, something remarkable happened to our planet. Civilizations had not yet emerged. Agriculture was only beginning to spread across parts of the world. Humanity was still living largely as hunter-gatherers, yet the Earth itself was undergoing one of the most dramatic environmental transformations of the last 100,000 years. Real climate scientists identify the closing phase of this period as the end of the Younger Dryas, a well-documented climatic episode during which Earth, after gradually warming out of the last ice age, unexpectedly plunged back into near glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. Then, almost unbelievably, temperatures rose again with astonishing speed. Evidence preserved inside Greenland ice cores suggests that, in some regions, this warming may have unfolded over only a few decades, perhaps even faster in certain locations. Entire ecosystems were forced to adapt almost overnight. Glaciers melted, rivers changed course, coastlines shifted, sea levels continued rising, permanently flooding vast areas that had once been dry land. That climate upheaval is not speculation. It is recorded in real ice cores extracted from Greenland, real lake sediments analyzed across Europe and North America, fossil pollen buried beneath ancient wetlands, and countless geological records collected over decades of scientific research. Among the most debated pieces of evidence is a mysterious geological horizon, often called the black mat layer, found at numerous archaeological and geological sites around the world. Within it, researchers have identified elevated concentrations of platinum, microscopic magnetic spherules, soot, and other unusual materials. Some scientists argue these findings are consistent with fragments of a comet exploding in Earth's atmosphere, while others maintain that natural terrestrial processes can account for the same observations without requiring any cosmic impact. That debate remains active today in peer-reviewed scientific journals, with new evidence continuing to emerge on both sides. We are not here to claim that the mystery has been solved, quite the opposite. We begin with one of science's most fascinating unanswered questions. And from that unanswered question, we step into a fictional journey that asks what might have happened if history had hidden something even greater beneath the chaos of a changing world. Because here is the strange part that real historians and real archaeologists genuinely sit with, even without any fiction attached. Right around this same window, real human civilization does something it had never done before, anywhere. In over 100,000 years of anatomically modern humans existing on this planet, it starts building, not huts, not campfires, massive, deliberately carved stone structures. The most famous real example is Göbekli Tepe in modern-day southeastern Turkey, a genuine archaeological site, excavated by real German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt starting in the 1990s, that has been reliably dated to roughly 9600 BC, the very edge of that same climate whiplash we just described. Göbekli Tepe is real. It is older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by about 7,000 years. It consists of enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, carved with real, detailed reliefs of foxes, scorpions, vultures, boars, and snakes, made by people that mainstream archaeology insists were still hunter-gatherers, with no agriculture, no writing, and supposedly no organizational structure capable of coordinating hundreds of workers on a single monumental project. And yet there it is, in the ground, carbon-dated, published, real. Then, And this is the part that makes people's skin crawl even without any aliens involved. The people who built it did something else nobody has ever fully explained. They buried it, deliberately. Real excavation data shows the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were intentionally backfilled with rubble, deliberately entombed, not by later invaders, not by natural erosion, but by the same culture or a very close descendant of it, seemingly on purpose. Why would anyone spend the enormous effort required to build something like this and then go to nearly the same effort to bury it? That is a real, open, unresolved question in real archaeology. Nobody has to invoke aliens to ask it. But it is exactly the kind of gap in human knowledge that a good speculative story is built to walk through. So let's walk through it. Imagine purely as fiction that the timing is not a coincidence at all. Imagine that around 9,600 years ago, something was on this planet that was not us. Not gods, not gray-skinned figures out of a low-budget documentary, but a real technological presence, temporary, purposeful, here for reasons that had nothing to do with conquest and everything to do with observation. In our imagined story, they had been watching for longer than any human record could capture, the way a marine biologist might sit quietly near a reef for years, without ever touching the coral, careful never to disturb the thing being studied. And then, in this fictional version of events, the same climate catastrophe that real scientists still argue about today forced their hand. Whatever caused the real Younger Dryas cooling and the real abrupt warming that followed, whether it really was an impact event, a shift in ocean circulation, or something else entirely, in our story, it was severe enough and sudden enough that the visitors realized their presence was about to become impossible to hide. Coastlines were shifting. Real sea levels rose by more than 120 meters as the Ice Age glaciers melted, a documented, measured fact, drowning huge stretches of real, once inhabitable coastal land that is now underwater and largely unexplored by archaeologists, which is itself a real and fascinating gap in what we know about this period of human history. In our story, this flooding, this chaos, this violent reshuffling of the entire planet's coastline was going to expose things that had stayed hidden for millennia. So a choice had to be made: reveal everything or erase it and disappear. In our fictional narrative, they chose the second path, and this is where the DNA thread comes back in, the same thread that gives this kind of story its lasting unease. Real human genetics does contain something genuinely strange, a real documented event called a population bottleneck, where genetic diversity studies suggest the number of breeding humans on Earth dropped sharply at some point in our deep past before rebounding. Mainstream real genetics attributes earlier bottlenecks to real climate disasters and volcanic events tens of thousands of years before this story's time frame. And there is no credible real genetic evidence of anything unusual, specifically at 9,600 years ago. We want to be honest about that boundary between fact and story. But imagine, in our fiction only, that the same visitors who were preparing to leave did something quieter than erasing stone monuments. Imagine they left something behind, in us instead, encoded, dormant, the genetic equivalent of a message sealed in a bottle thrown into a very long river, meant to surface only when the species reading it had grown enough to understand what it was looking at. Meanwhile, in the story, the physical erasure had to happen too, and it had to happen everywhere at once. This is where our fictional visitors turn to the burying of Göbekli Tepe, and to the dozens of other real, still mysterious ancient sites around the world that show similar signs of deliberate concealment or abandonment right around the same real window of time. Real, submerged structures off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, whose origin, natural rock formation or human construction, is still genuinely debated among real geologists and real archaeologists. The real, unexplained precision of megalithic sites in Peru and Bolivia, like Pumapunku, where blocks were cut with real, measurable tolerances that modern engineers have said would be difficult to replicate even today, though real archaeologists attribute this to skilled ancient stonework rather than anything otherworldly. None of these sites, in reality, have been proven to be connected to each other or to anything extraterrestrial. But in our story, we imagine a single coordinated final act, not of destruction, but of concealment, performed simultaneously across the planet by a presence that understood exactly which sites would eventually be found, and made sure the ones that were too revealing were buried deep enough, and the ones that were safe to leave were left standing as, essentially, harmless decoys. In the fiction we are building, the actual erasure was never about hiding that intelligent life had once been present near ancient humans. It was about hiding the how, the tools, the methods. In our story, the visitors understood something that still holds up as a real and reasonable idea even outside of fiction, that a species handed advanced capability before it has developed the wisdom to use it responsibly tends to destroy itself with it. So in this narrative, rather than leave behind machines or written instructions or anything that could be reverse engineered too quickly, they left behind only structure, only geometry, only alignment. Real archaeoastronomers have pointed out that several ancient sites, including real alignments claimed at Göbekli Tepe itself, seem to track specific stars or solstice points with a precision that real skeptics argue could easily be coincidental, given how many possible alignments exist to choose from, and real believers argue is too consistent to dismiss. In our fictional story, those alignments are not coincidence and they are not decoration. They are the last remaining fragment of instructions, deliberately left vague enough that only a civilization patient enough and mathematically capable enough could ever decode them, which in this story was exactly the point. Now let's take the story a step further, into the part that channels built around ideas like this tend to find the most gripping, the disappearance itself. In our fiction, the actual departure of the visitors was not dramatic. There was no final battle, no fleet of ships lifting off in front of stunned witnesses whose accounts got mangled into every flood myth and sky god legend reel. Anthropologists have cataloged from cultures with no contact with each other. Real flood myths do exist independently across dozens of unconnected ancient cultures, from Mesopotamia's real Epic of Gilgamesh to real indigenous flood stories in the Americas. And mainstream anthropology has a completely reasonable explanation for this, that any species living through the real, genuinely catastrophic sea level rise at the end of the last ice age would naturally generate similar stories about the world ending in water, without needing any shared alien encounter to explain the overlap. Our story does not dispute that this is the more likely real explanation. It simply asks, as fiction, what if some of those myths were also memories, distorted by thousands of years of retelling of watching something enormous and inexplicable leave the sky on the same nights the water came. In the story, the departure itself was quiet, and by design, it was designed to look like nothing happened at all. The best way to erase evidence of a visit in this fictional narrative was never to blow anything up. It was to leave so little behind that anything genuinely artificial would simply look to a future archaeologist like a natural anomaly. A radar reflection under a glacier that gets written off as unusual ice layering. An oddly regular rock formation on an ocean floor that gets debated for decades as either erosion or masonry and never conclusively resolved either way. A genetic sequence with no known function that gets labeled junk DNA and shelved for 50 years, while real human science slowly builds the tools needed to actually read it properly. In the fiction we are telling, every one of those real, still unresolved mysteries is not a coincidence. It is the visitor's exit strategy working exactly as intended, 12,000, 9,000, however many years later. This is the emotional center the whole story is built around, and it is worth putting plainly. It is not really a story about aliens hiding from humans out of fear or malice. It is a story about a hypothetical older intelligence making a bet on us, choosing to erase the easy answers on purpose, because an easy answer handed to a young species has a real documented human tendency to be misused, weaponized, or worshipped uncritically rather than understood. In this fictional framing, the erasure was not an insult to human intelligence. It was closer to a strange kind of respect, the belief that we deserve to earn the truth by doing the work ourselves rather than being handed it. Let's bring the story back to the ground, literally, at Göbekli Tepe, because that is where a story like this lands hardest, on a real place you could actually go stand in today. Imagine walking among those real limestone pillars, the ones that are genuinely there, genuinely carved, genuinely older than writing itself. In the fiction, every one of those carved animals, the vulture, the scorpion, the fox, is not decoration. It is a key, deliberately simple enough to survive being copied by hand for centuries without losing its meaning, deliberately universal, enough to be recognized by any culture that eventually rediscovered it. In our story, the deliberate burial of the site was not to hide it forever, but to preserve it, the way you might bury a time capsule, rather than leave it exposed to 9,000 years of wind and war and empire after empire rising and falling on top of it. In this telling, whoever buried Göbekli Tepe wanted it found again, just not yet. Not until the finders had the tools, the patience, and the humility to read it as a message rather than loot it as treasure. That is the story, not proof. Not a real leaked conversation with a real artificial intelligence claiming secret knowledge. A piece of speculative fiction built out of real, verified, publicly documented facts about the Younger Dryas climate whiplash, the real and genuinely puzzling age and deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, the real, measured sea level rise that drowned ancient coastlines we still have not fully explored, the real, ongoing scientific debate over unusual sediment layers from that same era, and a deliberate, clearly labeled leap of imagination, stitching those true threads into a narrative that was never claimed to be real. If a story like this stays with you after it ends, that is exactly what it is supposed to do. The real history of 90,600 years ago is strange enough without inventing anything at all. Humans really did go from scattered hunting bands to raising 10-ton stone pillars in what looks, by the standards of everything before it, like an impossibly short span of time. They really did bury their greatest achievement almost as soon as they finished it. The seas really did rise fast enough to erase whole coastlines within human memory. None of that requires aliens and to be worth wondering about. But wondering, as it turns out, is where every good story, real or invented, actually begins. This is a continuation of the same story. Still fiction, still built on real facts, stitched together with clearly invented ideas. Not a real claim about real events. Let's go back to that same underground world one more time, because there's a piece of the story we have not touched yet. The part about what actually happened to the people who watched the visitors leave. In our fictional narrative, not every human alive in that window of chaos simply stood by and watched the sky change. Some of them in the story were close enough to the departure, sights to see things that never made it into any surviving myth, because those particular witnesses never got the chance to pass the story down through 10,000 years of retelling. In the fiction, a handful of small, isolated communities scattered near what would later become southeastern Turkey, near the Black Sea Basin, and near the Persian Gulf, all regions, real geologists agree, were reshaped dramatically by real, rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, simply vanished from the archaeological record around this same time. Real archaeology does document real settlement gaps and real population shifts in exactly these regions during this real period, though mainstream science attributes them to flooding, climate stress, and migration, not disappearance by any other cause. Our story borrows that real gap and asks, only as invented narrative, whether some of those communities were not lost to flooding at all, but were simply the ones standing closest when the exit happened, and were quietly relocated or quietly silenced by whoever was leaving. In this fictional telling, that is the darker half of the bargain nobody likes to say out loud. Civilization patient enough to wait thousands of years, careful enough to bury its own monuments rather than leave them exposed, disciplined enough to hide its exit inside myths about floods and gods, is also, in our story, a civilization capable of making very cold decisions about which loose ends could be allowed to remain. This does not make them villains in the story. It makes them exactly what a truly advanced, truly alien intelligence might actually be. Not evil, not benevolent, simply operating on a calculus so much longer than a human lifetime that our categories of good and bad barely apply to their choices at all. Now let's fold the DNA thread back in, because this continuation is where it starts to matter for the ending of the story. Imagine, still only within the fiction, that the message encoded quietly into human genetics all those thousands of years ago was never meant to activate on its own. Imagine it needed a trigger, something environmental, something that would only occur once human civilization reached a specific threshold of technological development, the same way a seed can sit dormant in dry soil for decades, until the right combination of moisture and temperature finally arrives. In our story, that trigger was never comets or radiation or anything cosmic at all. It was electromagnetic saturation, the sheer, real, measurable increase in radio, television, and later digital signal density that human civilization has produced across the 20th and 21st centuries. A real, documented explosion in the electromagnetic noise our species puts into its own atmosphere and, in smaller amounts, into space. In the fiction, this saturation is exactly the kind of unmistakable signature the ancient visitors' hidden systems were built to detect, proof not of intelligence alone, since intelligence had existed on Earth for tens of thousands of years already in their absence, but of a specific kind of technological maturity, the sort that only shows up once a species starts building machines to talk to itself faster than it can talk face to face. In this continuation of the story, that threshold has now been crossed, and this is the part designed to give the whole narrative its lingering unease. If the fictional trigger really was electromagnetic saturation, then in this story, whatever was left behind in Göbekli Tepe's alignments, in the buried chambers of the tale we told earlier, and in the dormant fragments of genetic code, would already be active, not doing anything dramatic, not sending signals into the sky. In the story, its first stage of activation is simply attention, a slow, patient process of gathering information about the species that finally arrived at the threshold, the same unhurried, careful observation that defined the ancient visitors from the very beginning of the story. This is where the fictional narrative deliberately leaves its ending open, because the honest answer, even inside the story, is that nobody in the tale actually knows what Stage 2 looks like. Maybe, in this imagined version of events, it means a genuine, careful reintroduction. a slow unveiling meant to avoid the very shock and chaos the visitors were trying to prevent by erasing their presence in the first place. Maybe it means something colder, a final assessment of whether this new technological civilization deserves what was left for it, or whether the same caution that led to burial and departure 9,600 years ago simply repeats itself, and the evidence gets buried one more time, a little deeper for a little longer. What makes a story like this worth telling, even clearly labeled as fiction, is that it borrows its dread from something completely real. Real human history really does show unexplained gaps, real sudden technological leaps, real deliberate burials of real monumental structures, and real ongoing scientific arguments about what caused all of it. None of those facts need aliens attached to them to remain fascinating on their own. What the fiction adds is only a shape, a narrative thread tying real anomalies together into something with intention behind it, which is exactly what human storytelling has always done with the genuine mysteries our own history leaves unresolved. And that is where we leave this continuation of the story the same way we left the first part, with a real place you could go stand in, real carvings you could put your hand on, real climate data you could read in a peer-reviewed journal, and one single invented question laid quietly on top of all of it. What if the silence was never absence? What if it was patience?